This is the farmhouse where I grew up, where my father grew up, where my grandfather grew up, where my great grandfather grew up. The main house was built in 1860. We got electricity in 1943 with the Rural Electrification Act. And now what I am doing is I'm removing the majority of the 1960 updates and reverting the era back to somewhere between 1920 and 1950. I'm going to show you each room in the order that I did them years ago. While I am no more of a carpenter or a designer than any member of my family has ever been, I'm doing it to suit me and my tastes. Like the bathroom, we were going to have to level the floor in the living room. We thought that all we were going to have to do is pull up the rug and then lay down the vinyl floor. However, when we pulled up the rug, we found that there was particle board under the rug, and everybody told me that you can't put vinyl floor on top of particle board. So we were going to have to pull up the particle board and get down to the original 1860 vintage floor. And so we started pulling up a few sections, and we quickly realized that this particle board is absolutely miserable to pull up. And as we got around the corner from the bathroom, there was the old register. So that was going to have to be filled because we weren't using forced air anymore. So with a little plywood and some pocket screws, we had filled up that register hole. And then before we pulled up too much more, we wanted to turn our attention to how much the floor was out of level. We know that the main beam had dropped because the center post that is on bedrock, the bottom of it had rotted a little and it had sank. But with timber, you can't just jack it up because it can take, as we found out in our barn, it can take 1.5 years to 2 years for the set to be removed from the timber. So this image right here gives you an example or an idea of how much the floor was out. Now, everything had to be indexed. As I said when we did the bathroom, it had to be indexed off that sliding door. That was going to be the guide to leveling the rest of the floor. And here you can see we set in the first piece of plywood just to see just what it was going to look like. And here you can see we pulled up a bit more of the rug and the particle board. And here we've laid in the first 3 strips to level out that piece of 3/4 plywood right in front of the bathroom door. And because the living room was the largest room of the house, and we were still living there as we were doing the work, we were moving things around to give us room to do construction, but still be able to make it reasonably habitable. So you can see that we pulled up a section of the rug and underlayment going all the way to the kitchen, and we were going to level that out. And when we reached the kitchen, you can see where the floor transitioned from the 1860 section of the house to the 1915 section of the house. And that gap that was left in 1860 that was covered by the threshold, we filled it with the concrete floor leveling compound in 2 pours to get it up level. And here is the second piece butted against the first piece of plywood. And then at the very end, we're stepping down from 3/4 to half as we're starting to come up out of the dip towards the kitchen. And beside that now level section, you can see where they pieced the floor together. And it was very obvious why they put down the underlayment and a rug, because you could look straight down into the cellar because the boards had shrunk over the last 150 years. So we had to fix that with some spray foam, and we spray foamed all the gaps so that it would stop the cold air from coming up through. Next, we cleaned out that one corner of the living room, and you could see that there is a dip, and we weren't too sure why there was a dip there. At first we thought it was the particle board but later on we found that it was not. And here's a close-up. You can see just how dramatic that dip is over a very short area. So we put down more shims and more leveling plywood, and we've got it over to that wall, but in the center of the image here is that dip, and we were trying to figure out why it had dip. And here's that same corner with a different angle. So going down cellar, what we discovered was the planks had, I don't know whether it was a crack or what, but they had taken a dip right there. So we pulled down the insulation, the rigid insulation that we had put between the timbers, and screwed in a piece of 3/4 plywood to stiffen that area up. And then, like we did in the bathroom, we put down bonding solution and then started doing pours of the leveling concrete. And that leveling concrete was going to be the transition from the plywood to the kitchen wall. And then on the other side of the room, as we started to pull up the underlayment, we saw this giant crack where the boards had cracked and separated. That section right there, you can see the kerosene line coming in. That's where our Laser 73 heater sat. And it looks like, because that is setting over the 2-foot thick rubble stone foundation, that something settled a little bit and produced that crack, and it went down into the stone. You could see the stone down through the crack. So what we did was we spray foamed the whole area to fill that crack and keep the air from coming out, because when we exposed it initially, you could feel the cold air coming up through. And we continued on pulling up the underlayment. We found that the easiest way was to partially pull up every single nail in a sheet and then go at it with a shingle removing tool. I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's for removing shingles on a roof. You'd get under the underlayment and then start prying, and because you've got the nails mostly pulled, big sections would come up where if you were just trying to pull it up with the nails all the way down into that hard floor from 1860, you would get little tiny chunks and they go flying across the room. And we pulled up another big section, and you can see where some of the floor is dark brown where it was stained, some was painted the yellow ochre, and you can see where the old wall used to be. Back in the 60s, that wall was taken down and that bedroom was removed, and the living room was expanded into that area to make a gigantic living room. There's that tool I was talking about for pulling up the shingles, and it did a fabulous job of pulling up that underlayment because it was nailed down with a million nails. So by this time we had half the room level. So now we are heading from the bathroom across the living room towards the outside wall. And there's the first piece we laid in. Instead of going lengthwise, we're going crossways, because at the end of that piece of plywood on the left, that is where the section of the floor is over the stone wall, and that was artificially high. And then the second piece of plywood was laid down. And here's what I was talking about. As soon as the floor reached the area that is over the stone wall, it could not sink because the stone wall is on bedrock. So if you notice the little gap there, that's going to be filled in with that leveling compound again to make it reasonably level. It's never going to be perfect. And then, like I said earlier, we laid down some of the leveling cement, and then the underlayment was pulled up. And you can see where the rug was in the center of the room, and they had painted first kind of a dark brown, and then they went with the yellow ochre going around the room. And here we have another register hole, and you can see it is in the corner, right tight against the left wall and the outer wall. And that was filled in with a chunk of plywood and some pocket screws and a little bit of caulk. And we started off here with some shims, because dropping from 3/4 to a half wasn't going to work right there. And then next we dropped in the 1/2-inch plywood so that it could be feathered down to 1/4-inch plywood. And that was feathered down to nothing at all with the leveling cement again. And with 3/4 of the room done, we had to turn our attention to the window wall and move that TV out of there on the Frink plastic. That's that orange stuff that Frink snowplow used to use to make plows. And the stuff is very slippery, and once you get it under something, it's very easy to slide it. And we use that to move furniture and everything else imaginable. And with the TV out of the way, now we had to start pulling nails, as you can see here, and then up popped the last 2 pieces of the underlayment. And as before, we laid down more of the concrete leveling cement. We also had to do it the full length of the living room, right tight against the wall, because there was a dip where farther down, that was where that giant crack was. Here there wasn't a crack, there was just a dip. So we just put the bonder down and poured in the concrete and let it seek its own level, and then just feather the edges a little bit. And here's another angle on that strip that was along the wall to level that out. You can still see that there's a bit of a dip, but we took care of most of it. And then on the level section, we just put down MH Ready Patch over all of those cracks where the boards had shrunk over the years, the tongue and groove floorboards, so that there would be no telegraphing of those seams through the vinyl floor. And that is how we leveled the floor in our living room in preparation for the vinyl floor.